Just me.
Great. Right and left. Thank you. I tried to turn it on and it didn't do anything. Okay. So, I think the real reason you might all be gathered here with me today, other than my smiling face, is that we have a new exhibit opening at Tower Grove House on the second floor and the East Wing. Last year you saw the Upper East Wing in a variety of states. It was all prepared for wallpaper, and we were interpreting essentially how we build an exhibit because that exhibit was still in process. So at this moment, we are getting much closer to being able to open that exhibit when the house reopens on the 30th of March. So this year we reopen here in just 2 weeks. When I say that aloud, I get nervous, but this exhibit is a great opportunity to share the life of the Trelease family, which is something that we've done in a variety of ways, but never in a real directed way because we've never had the great visual that we're going to have now to really share that information. The Trelease family, as I've gotten to know them through research, are very special to me now because they have a lot of very interesting things that happen in the course of their existence within Tower Grove House. They truly are the first family of the garden, and so we have the wonderful opportunity to share a variety of much bigger themes as they relate to both the garden but also to the St. Louis community at that time. So the packet that most of you received, I hope everyone got a copy. If you didn't, don't worry. I will send them out digitally as well, so you can have a copy if you prefer to read online. The packet that you received is the interpretive plan for this exhibit. So it's broken down by themes. A lot of the themes that we are sharing are very big, which is why there's a 2-page resource list on the back of this, because there might be something that strikes your fancy and you're able to read more about it. But I certainly could not encapsulate it all within the document that I've shared because, again, some of the things that we're talking about are quite large in topic. The title of the exhibit is called Life at Home, the Trelease Family at Tower Grove House. I chose this title because this is about Tower Grove House being a home and being a place where someone raised their family and a place that I am certain was very near and dear to the Treleases, even beyond when they left Tower Grove. As I mentioned, we have a few key themes. We'll be talking quite a bit about family life in the 20th century. So we have one bedroom that discusses life both as a child and about child rearing, bringing children into this world. The Trelease family would have had 4 children while they lived within Tower Grove House. Excuse me. Making it a more than just a early birthing center. It would have been a place where they would have been raising their children. Being a child in the 20th century is very different. That would have been a formative time in terms of how education was offered, as well as the Trelease boys using the garden as their backyard. We have one very interesting oral history from another child who lived on garden grounds at that time who shares some of the trouble that they got into as children playing in the garden, and some of those more personal narratives that I think a lot of our visitors relate to. Many of our visitors, as you know, will come and say, I used to bicycle through the garden, or do things like that. Thank you. And so we have some of those stories to share.
Are those stories in our package?
So there is quite a few a description within that packet, but I will also make that a printed material that is a resource within the house or something. I don't know the best way to deliver it to you because it's rather lengthy. But it's something that I certainly could print and have a copy on hand at the house and kind of outline the sections or the pages that you might want to read again because it's rather lengthy.
Family life is also a very complicated issue, as you'll read in that text. William, Dr. Trelease, and his wife Julia would lose 2 children while they lived within Tower Grove House. So we talked quite a bit about how children, child mortality rate, as well as how sanitation plays a role in how people were able to live at that time. A lot of the renovation of the home is due to sanitary needs. So you see some sections about that within that text, which is a very interesting read. That sounds like a strange thing, but I've become increasingly interested in waterways through the course of this. We also share quite a bit about Mrs. Trelease. She's a very interesting person and becomes kind of her own character. As I've gotten to know her, I've come to appreciate her more and more. We have one whole room that talks about scientific exploration and some of the expeditions that Dr. Trelease would have gone on. He was a part of the Harriman expedition in Alaska. He also traveled throughout the Azores, which is a tiny island off the coast of Portugal, which has a lot to do with work that the garden still does today, which is encapsulated in that document. We also typed quite a bit about how Tower Grove House was rebuilt. As many of you know, people love architecture. They want to know the difference between the size, how things were rebuilt, the technology of a bathroom and running water being installed. So a lot of that information is also within here. As I mentioned, sharing more about how the Board of Trustees systems works. Many visitors are surprised to find out that we're not owned by the city, that we have always been a part of a Board of Trustees after Mr. Shaw passed. And this Board of Trustees was very important in identifying what the needs of the house were, which were to completely demolish it and to rebuild it on the east wing, which is what people will be standing in. As I mentioned, sanitation, we talk about water, we talk about how that flush toilet would work, as well as how that impacted the architecture. So as we all know, Tower Grove House is a wonderful Italianate home, but that rebuild in 1890 would change how it fit into Italianate design in that it's much more akin and symmetrical, where Mr. Shaw had designed it to show the difference between his wealth on one side and his house help on the other. And so we talk about technology and how things were built. We talk more about how we have gotten to enjoy that running water, what the function of that would have been. Again, all encapsulated in brief ways within your document, but also there are many resources on the back that tell you more about that. We also have a wonderful section within that document about Dr. William Trelease. Dr. Trelease is a very interesting man. He's a very relatable character and someone that I'm looking forward to being able to share more about with the public. He's extremely interesting to me because he, prior to going to school for botany, was trained by his father, who was a metal worker, which means his intention in life was to carry on his family trade. But because he enjoyed being outside so much, he enjoyed hunting, fishing, and just being outside, he became a collector, where he would go out into the woods, essentially, as he was doing some of those activities, and collect things. And through that process, fell in love with botany. And that's something that we've shared in a variety of programs, like our Collection of Curiosity program, that anyone can be a collector, anyone can be a botanist. And Dr. Trelease is truly proof of that. He attends college, first at Cornell, and then he goes to Harvard, where he would meet Dr. Asa Gray, who we all know, who would eventually help him find his way to becoming the Engelman Professor at the new Washington University Botany Department, and then eventually as the as the first director of the garden. I call him the first director of the garden because Henry Shaw is the founder of the garden, and while he did direct activities, in most citations they consider Dr. Trelease the first director of the garden because that indicates that he was intentionally chosen and hired to be the person managing the garden. Is everyone still with me? Dr. Trelease, as I mentioned, would also come here with a wife, Julia, and 2 children. Julia, as I mentioned, is a very interesting character. She would firstly attend college at the University of Wisconsin. That's where she would meet Dr. Trelease while he was a professor and she was a student. She would have received a Bachelor of Letters degree, which today is the equivalent of a general arts and science degree. But she would have taken classes in the classics, Latin, Greek. She would have taken philosophy, but then she also would have taken hard sciences like botany, chemistry, geology. And so through that process, we talk quite a bit in that document about how women's roles were transitioning in society, that a woman could go to college and then may have to choose between becoming a wife or having a career. This is something that we have not talked about yet in the home. There's also quite a bit within that document about women who were working out in the world. About 20% of the workforce in St. Louis at the time that the Trelease family would have lived here were women doing jobs either within a home or working within factories. So we talked more about how women were transitioning roles. Julia would eventually cite herself as an assistant to the botanical garden when asked on alumni records. We don't know exactly what that means or what role she would have been playing. We do know, as we talk about working women, that she would have had some house help, a nanny probably for her children, but then also a cook, housekeeper. Her name was Mrs. Smalley. I mentioned her within the document. We learned about her more from that oral history, as I mentioned. And they would have helped care for their children. As I mentioned, the Trelease family would come here with 2 children, an older boy, Frank, and then their daughter, Marjorie. Within 6 months of living here, Marjorie would pass at Tower Grove House from cerebral meningitis, which is also within that document because that's not something that's still described as an illness today. So a visitor might ask you what exactly that is. It has to do with fluid in your spinal column that would come from a bacterial infection. And so very early in their time in Tower Grove House, William and Julia would have been dealing with a lot of personal issues as Dr. Trelease was trying to get his feet beneath him. Then I mentioned that Julia would eventually give birth to 4 more children within the house, 3 of which who would survive. And so a lot of the issues of family life at that time are still very relevant and connective points to visitors today. Medicine was much different at that time. Germ theory was much different at that time. But it helps people realize that these aren't just people in a book that we're talking about. These are real people who were having real life emotional struggles that were within this home as they unfolded. The children, they had all boys then within Tower Grove House. And those boys, as I mentioned, we don't know exactly if they would have attended a school or if a tutor would have come in. We don't have a record of that. But a lot of the signage shares what children would have been doing at that time, both going to school, but then what kind of recreation they would be doing, how gender would have played a role in that. As I mentioned, that oral history was of a female, and so she speaks a lot about what she and another girl who lived on grounds would have been doing versus what the boys were doing and when they would play together. Yes.
Okay, so 4 boys, and then there was 1 girl then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then 1 stillborn child.
Right,
So.
okay. So the girl was older, the oldest?
It would have been Frank and then the daughter.
And then, so the Frank is the one that died?
No, Marjorie is the one that
Marjorie.
passed.
Oh, okay.
Yes, but
So-
then she would have gone on to have more children after.
Right, okay.
Yes.
So then a total of how many children?
That would be a total of 6.
6. A total of 6.
Yes. So yes, there's lots of really great meaty issues to talk about in here. Again, this is the first time we've had the opportunity to talk about women's issues, the first time we've talked about children. Bless Henry, but he was riding solo, so we haven't had the chance to talk about some of these things that are really pivotal, especially at the turn of the 20th century. Things were changing as industrialization was changing, the home dynamics were changing. Again, I hope I've represented some of that in that document, but there's a lot of great resources that can give you more if you really want to know more about some of those topics. As I mentioned, we also talked quite a bit about scientific exploration. The Harriman expedition is this very, very cool thing where a whole bunch of really famous botanists, as well as the family of a really rich man, Harriman, set out on this beautiful boat through the Alaskan wild. And so they were collecting specimens, they were collecting animals, they were taking photos, and the Harriman expedition has become kind of the cornerstone of what is untouched Alaska. So for conservationists, many people who are looking at how the land has changed over time with human use, this Harriman expedition is the original capturer of untouched Alaska. And Dr. Trelease was there. He's somewhere in this photo, still can't find his face. But he's in there somewhere. But he would have been joined by people like John Muir and some of the really famous guys. This is a very cool thing. Again, I could write about this for days, but there's a page in there. There's more resources. A lot of the photos from this experience are digitized through University of, might be Oregon. It's in there. And so you can see a lot of the really great visuals. There's also many journals. All of the specimens they collected took over 10 years to process. So a lot of different places just beyond the garden have specimens from this experience. Very cool. I also mentioned the Azores. You'll see it spelled two different ways. I think historically it's spelled with a U. Now I believe there's an O in the center. So they mean the same thing. But this is a cute little island off the coast of Portugal that Dr. Trelease did quite a bit of research about. He traveled to in the early 1890s. This would have been his first expedition as director of the garden. And he did a lot of theory work at that time about how plant genetics work in terms of island chains. So in a similar fashion to what Darwin was trying to prove about genetic mutations from different places, he was trying to prove the same thing in relationship to plants. At that time, he was not able to do that, but through DNA technology in the present, the Botanical Garden has been able to identify that he was correct. And Dr. Wise Jackson himself did a lot of that work and has written papers about it. You'll see in the resource guide a PDF to find Dr. Trelease's original content, but I will make all that available as well in a resource guide, as well as I'm still trying to find where Dr. Wise Jackson's paper about his findings. So when I find all of that, it will all come together in a nice little book. But this is a very cool thing, and would have been quite a bit of his work while he was here at the garden. Dr. Trelease was also quite prolific in terms of his legacy of scientific naming. In the course of his life, he correctly identified and named over 2,000 plant species, which is quite remarkable for that time, because in the 1900s, all you had were books to compare images to, essentially. So you would go out and find something you thought was new, and then you'd have to look through all of the pertinent literature at that time to identify if that was the case. If it's brand new, then you'd have to completely describe it and go through a process and then publish it to make it officially on record. All of these things gave us lots of cool samples. Today, I'm going to pick up copies of everything we have in our herbarium that we can share with the public as touchables. They're pictures, the high resolution scans of some of the things he collected in a lot of these exploration moments. And so we will have handouts essentially that we can hand to visitors to say, these are the types of things he was collecting in different places. Is everyone still with me? Yes, Rose. Yes, Rose.
Two questions, actually.
Yes, great.
Did no one think it was unusual that a man who accepted the position of directorship of the Missouri Botanical Garden went off on this exploration thing? I'm happy he didn't. I know he was accomplished. But isn't that unusual that he would take that on and this new job?
That's a reasonable question. So he would have gone to the Azores in, I believe, 1894, and then the Harriman expedition would be 1896 or 97. So he would have been settled in a few years. Exploration at this time would have been the way to put your name on the map, essentially. That what he was doing, you could see as work to bring awareness to the garden. And while Henry Shaw was an interested party, he was not a botanist. And so when Dr. Trelease came to the garden, it became very clear that it was time to enhance that botanical legacy and focus on what that looked like on a worldwide scale, which is very much the mission that we still follow today, and that we're in 30 some odd countries, and that we have scientists all over the world doing a lot of this work. So I would say it's more of a testament to his focus on being a traditional botanist, and bringing some, this is the way you get specimens in your collection, is go out and gather them. Where until this time, Henry Shaw had just known the right people who had donated to the garden, thankfully. And so he was, I think this is him establishing that educational and
Credentials.
the credentials as the garden as a botanical entity.
Plus, he was friends, what you said, with Asa Gray,
Mm-hmm.
so he had connections.
Yes.
Is there any hint or documentation that perhaps Julia, as she had listed herself as sort of being an assistant, probably took on a role while he was gone?
That's a very interesting question, and no, we do not have records of that. What is interesting is that a lot of the information that I've offered you do not come from our archive, which is not an issue with our archive in that we capture our own history in a different way. And so in that other places are seeing this as a historical moment, we're just seeing it as our life, and so we don't have any pictures of the inside of the house, but I found an old scrapbook from the Trelease family at the University of Illinois where I finally got a picture of Julia and William together in older years. And so we've been gathering information from all of these different places because institutionally that was just operations. That wasn't a moment to say, let's take a picture or let's write down who was actually running the garden, because at that time, while she was educated and a very interesting person, I doubt that the board would have written down in a newsletter that she was running the garden, even if that were the case. Right. So that's another gender issue that we don't have a lot of information about. Yes, Elaine.
I mean, what all you're telling us is amazing, and I was just thinking, is there any coordination between the museum building and what you are doing at Tower Grove House? Because it seems like they kind of are going hand in hand with what's going on with the Trelease,
Yes.
Collections and all of that.
That's a good question. So at this point, the museum building has an exhibit schedule of their own exhibit topics, which we support. And so we're represented, for example, the next exhibit in the museum building is a paper exhibit. It's about how paper is made and the plants that are associated with paper. And we have supported them. We'll have at least 2 cases of objects that come from the Tower Grove House collection that represent Henry Shaw and his prolific writing, letters and all the other things that we've enjoyed for years. In terms of
I mean, those collections that
Right.
Trelease brought back.
yes.
I mean, wouldn't they have been stored in the museum building, or am I missing out on how that would have worked?
Yes, for a short time. Part of Dr. Trelease's work at the garden would have been moving the herbarium because they outgrew that building. Early 1900s.
Oh, really?
For a short time, it would have been stored in the basement of the admin building. Our herbarium's been a traveling show.
Okay.
But I agree with you in that a lot of, if this was the topic of the day, then people would have been coming here to do research on the items that were being brought back, and they absolutely would have been in the museum. So there's certainly a connection, especially if you're talking about any of these things, that it's a very easy connection to say, you know, these would have been stored at that museum building. If you haven't been there, you should take a visit. But in terms of content of exhibits, right now we're not yet synced, but we're working towards that in the future, because our schedule is a little bit different than their schedule still. And so hopefully in the future we can continue to find where those connection points are. But you're absolutely correct in terms of place to share with visitors about where some of that stuff would have been kept. Rose, did you have two questions?
And actually,
Sorry, I'm coming
do you
back.
have time?
Oh yes, I got time. If
Okay.
anybody needs to leave, as usual, I care for you all, and if you need to be on time somewhere, you may go. But don't hesitate to get up if you need to go.
As you're explaining Mr. Trelease and his wife, I can see a correlation with why Henry Shaw would have chosen him, for one thing.
He didn't.
And I also, when I'm in the house, I like to bring up that while Henry Shaw was traveling, his sister Carolyn
Well,
took
yeah.
over the business.
Oh, yeah.
And that was pretty advanced for a man that lived during that time.
Right.
So again, there's that correlation. And so I also had the question, who did run the garden when Trelease was on the Harriman
That's a good
expedition?
question. So,
That should be documented somewhere. And I do have one more question after that.
okay. It's so great. No, I love
You
it.
brought it up.
So in terms of running the garden, it's much like it is today, and that Dr. Weiss Jackson travels all over the world all the time. There would have been a superintendent of the garden.
True.
His this throat. Mr. Irish would have been is the father of that oral history I keep referring to. So his daughter is the one that's told us a lot about what was going on at that time. So he would have been doing the daily operations as the superintendent. He would have been making sure everybody was still working and things were watered, you know, the basics. But much like it is today, there was a board of trustees who could make decisions, and there were plenty more employees at that time. It was becoming taking more of a shape of an organization versus just Henry Shaw hiring someone to build a wall or work to plant these trees. You know, it was becoming more of a business, so to speak. And so while I don't have any record that says this person is the vice president, so to speak, you know, he certainly would have had plenty of people here he trusted to help him.
And one more question, it never occurred to me until I came into this room and heard you talking. If the Tower Grove of Henry Shaw's country home was so bad, I mean, as far as sanitation and all that, after they moved the city house to where it is, why didn't the Trelease family move into the city house? Did it have running water and
That's a good question.
sewer?
I would say
I
that,
never thought about
I
that
would say
before.
maybe, my best guess would be that the intention of this space was always to be an office. They've always called it an admin building, and that it's had a variety of things going in. The addition was built within a short time after it was moved. And so I think the intention was always something different. I think part of why Dr. Trelease and his family would have lived in the home is also that Henry Shaw decided they would have lived on garden grounds. So
Yeah.
the only place
City
to
house,
live,
But they could have moved to the
right,
city
that's a
house
home,
if
right.
they would have
but,
thought about that.
and this is a good segue into what you just mentioned, Barb, which I did not cover, so thank you for mentioning that, in that when you say that Henry chose Dr. Trelease for the garden, you could say that in an extended way, in that a few years before he passed, he helped establish that Engelman professorship at Washington University when he began the School of Botany there. And so he would have known Dr. Trelease. Dr. Trelease would have visited on multiple occasions before he received that job. And at that time, it was a professorship. And then after a year of work there, Henry would have decided that that person would also become the director of the garden. which means he would have known that it was Dr. Trelease who was in that position, and he chose for that person to also become the director of the
Did
garden.
you pick him to be in that position?
He was a part of the advisory committee.
Okay.
As I mentioned, the Asa Gray connection, Asa Gray would have called him and said, hey, I know this really talented guy, you should consider him. And that's how he became involved with getting the job at Washington University. Yes, Brenna?
I wonder if the move into Tower Grove House wasn't just a matter of, that was the expeditious thing to do, because the will required that the director live in the
Right.
garden.
Right.
And it took, what, 2 years?
It did.
To build the house?
Right, and so my segue back to that is that after Henry Shaw died in August, the Trelease family would have moved into Tower Grove House like at the end of September, October. I mean, they were like right in there. There was no layover, and then the house would have been rebuilt in pretty
Fast forward.
pretty fast. In the completion time is like 6 months in 1890, which is crazy. I mean, all the way from tear down to rebuild, very, very short amount of time. And so I can't presume, I don't have any written record, but I can only presume that they just lived on the west side of the house, because I have no record that they lived elsewhere.
And didn't it take a longer time for the house, the city house to be moved to
Yes.
the grounds?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
they ran into a lot of money problems
Yes.
and they had to have, so who knows exactly when that
Right,
was.
completed.
Yeah, so they
Yes.
had a place to go at least in
Yes.
the side of Henry side.
Yes.
Did they attribute the child's death to the problems in the house?
That's a good question. I have no written record that that is the case. However, the child died from a bacterial infection. She was 9 months old. And normally those types of infections come from water-based illnesses. So there's no official record of that. There's no connection. It's not like any of our newsletters or anything else share that. However, there was conversation based on some of those bulletins that you can read that you see that we're just going to install some running water or we're going to do these updates, and then they were swayed to completely demolish that side of the house and rebuild it to something new. So I haven't matched the dates between the bulletins with her becoming deceased, but you could make that inference. I don't know if it's particularly efficient to the interpretive process to share that, because that's not, I wouldn't say that's the most relative thing about that story that is connected.
You also don't know if there was an outbreak
Right.
of
Right.
reported in the city, because
Right.
it would not be limited just to the house.
Exactly.
If the
Exactly.
bacteria was there, it would
Exactly.
be part of it would be in the city as well.
Right.
Outbreaks like that are like
It's not the
wildfire.
normal.
They're
Yeah.
like
Water is
wildfire,
not
just
the
like
normal
the
spread
current
of
measles
bacterial meningitis.
Right.
outbreak in Washington.
So I would not necessarily make that connection to a visitor outrightly. If they made that connection themselves, then that's their choice. But I think it's more relevant that was an experience that they were having at a very pivotal moment as they're moving in, and that was a very tragic experience. Yes, Brenna.
Where did they live before moving out here?
I don't have any record of that. They must have lived, I don't have any record that Washington University gave them housing, or where, or what the tradition was at that time. I know that professors sometimes lived on grounds or they had housing for professors. I don't know that. They moved to St. Louis from Madison, Wisconsin. And so they would have.
Do you know how long they lived in St. Louis as he
So
was?
he would have been hired in 1886,
Oh,
1885. So just a few years.
Not too long.
Just a few years before that decision was made, and then they would have moved to Garden Ground. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that, Fredna, but
And he's buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery.
He is
so
buried-
he must have felt a connection.
he's buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery. They interpret that he's buried there because Marjorie was buried there first. And so as the first person in their family to pass, they bought a plot for her there. And so they moved to Illinois and onward after leaving the garden. And then both he and Julia and then another of the boys would come back here to be buried because that's where their family plot was. And that stillborn baby is also in that plot as well. So that might just be a coincidence, but in that they were the first person in the family to become deceased. But
So what were his years at Tower Grove House?
he would be the director of the garden, I would say, from the end of 1889, essentially when Henry Shaw passed, until 1912.
And then did he go to another directorship?
He went to the University of Illinois
Okay.
to become a professor. He went back to being a professor in a more traditional sense. And so a lot of his archives are there. He became, he probably would have been in this photo I showed here is probably about 1900. He probably would be in his 40s, late 40s maybe by the time he leaves the garden. And then he would go to Illinois, and that's where he would finish his tenure. Yeah. But he did work. I mean, there's records that he worked until
50-something.
the day he passed. So he was
57.
He was born 50-something.
Yes.
57. You know why he left? school?
I don't know specifically, because that would be something that, again, they'd have to write down. That's probably not a kind thing. You know, that's something that you don't put in a newsletter. I'm sure it says somewhere that he left because he had an opportunity to become a professor. But oral history says that there were a lot of political things going on. He had to work with the Board of Trustees quite a bit, which was there was a well-known relationship.
Bad relationship.
Yeah, they had some challenges coming to, because he was a botanist. His goal was to move the scientific arm of the garden forward, and the Board of Trustees were the mayor and bankers and lawyers and people from the community who had probably more operational things in mind. So that relationship, I'm sure, working for any company is a challenge. But it's a bigger opportunity. I mean, if you wanted to go back to traditional botany work, then being a professor is the place to be. Sorry.
When I think about what was going on building-wise in those few years right after Henry's death, so we have the restoration of the building of the east wing, we have the of the Tower Grove House, and then the Herring House also was built at that time,
Yes.
and the planning and the beginning of the moving, and so it would seem to me there was plenty of stuff for the Board of Trustees
Yes,
to
take care of.
A tremendous amount of
Change.
expenditure too.
Yes, and that was a big moment of change. I mean, we certainly can appreciate that beyond that scientific contribution that he guided the garden through the transition to essentially what we operate today in terms of having a board and having employees and having a director that guides our mission and focus. So I would certainly acknowledge that that's important as well. Are we all still okay? All still smiling? Okay. So we still, as you know, we'll still have a bedroom, as I mentioned, that will speak about the life of children, interpreted as a child's room. We have an adult bedroom. That signage shares women's roles, Julia going to college, some of those more connective things. Again, this is all signage that will be on the wall, and I want to share these with you because then you know how you can fill in those gaps in terms of what, if there's signage on the wall about some of these topics, then people are going to start asking you questions, additional information, or wanting to know more based on what kind of signage we have up on the wall. There is a bathroom. Oh, the mess.
It doesn't look like that
It doesn't look like that right now. But there is going to be signage next to the bathroom on the wall that talks about the technology of a restroom. And then the hallway, as you enter from the west wing, will have signage on it that talks about architecture, rebuilding, some of that more technical stuff that a lot of people ask about. And then in this room that's across from the office, I'm having a hard time figuring out what to call it, because the scientific research, the study, yeah, I don't know what to call it. This is where we will talk about that scientific research. As I mentioned, this is actually going to be a free moving space while people walk in, versus these rooms which will have their stanchions back. Which means people can walk into this room. As I mentioned, we'll have the samples from these trips, the copies of those samples that people can pick up and look at. There'll be signage on the wall that talks about these things. The television will have more photos of the restoration on them. So I'll be expanding this PowerPoint, and then Cassidy will be making a video about how we do what we do. So there'll be some digital media in this room. I hope this room will expand more as we grow, because there's more room in this space, especially since people can enter. And so there's lots of places to be. That was a lot of information. Yes, Jen.
Can I add two things?
Nope, only questions.
So Haley's mentioned signage on the walls. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the signage on the wall in no way replaces the interactions and the conversations that you all give.
No.
In any way. We just recognize that we all can't be everywhere throughout the house. Some days have more volunteers than others. We also recognize that our visitorship, some people want to read signs, they want to capture every word, and they don't really want to talk to us. And others, all they want to do is talk to you and they don't want to read signs. So this is just one other way of telling that story. And then the second thing is, Haley and I are working very closely together so that the East Wing, this is the first chapter in Life After Shaw. Our goal over the course of the next 5 to however many years before we retire is to look at that East Wing as an opportunity to tell the next chapter and the next chapter. So the first is Dr. Trelease, but our hope is that this East Wing will change out from year to year. So that you guys will have fresh and new information. So this is just one chapter. Next year, hopefully you'll have another chapter to add with new information, so on and so forth. Because a lot of life happened in that house after Henry Shaw passed away, and so we're working to tell that.
Yeah, and it's especially important now that we can offer a more holistic picture to our visitors, that we help people really, I hope this is going to be our opportunity to help people really realize that this is where our garden began. This is the center nucleus where all things grew from. No matter what country we're in, no matter where we are, this is where the garden began. And really reinforcing that beyond Henry Shaw and his gift to the garden, so to speak, there were a lot of people who lived and worked in this space that really changed how we see what we have today. And so I'm very excited that we have that opportunity in a more holistic way to share some of this all these newfound stories. That's my goal with all of these things. Many of the things on this list have to do with giving you more stories to share, to have a visual that you can pick from and pick one thing out and tell a visitor a story about it. Because that's the goal of an artifact profile, regardless of where it is in the house. That you can see something, that you can point at something, that a visitor says, oh, that's really interesting, and then you have a story to share about that. That's my goal with all of this information that we continue to
One more
share.
thing.
Yes, Jen.
At the end of last year, the garden formed an exhibit committee, which is, I don't want to say it's new, but we resurrected something that had existed a while ago. And I represent education on this committee. Neshka Pfeiffer, who's the curator of the museum, is on that committee, as well as other disciplines from around the garden. And what we're charged with, and working with Dr. Weiss-Jackson and senior leadership, is to look at what a 5-year rolling exhibition plan is for the garden. And that includes everything from what happens on garden grounds, like the Chihulis and the Nickies and the Flora Borealises, but then also looking at the layers that are the museum, Tower Grove House, floral shows, so that our hope is in the future, we will have some years where there is a very interconnected experience. So there's one idea on the table for literary gardens or garden plants and literacy. And so if you can imagine, if that was a theme for the year, what that might look like, what Tower Grove House could cover, and the writings of Shaw and other influential people in his life, but then what the museum could do, which would be the next stage, and then what we could do across garden grounds. So that's what we're working towards. So I'm really excited about how, to sort of go back to your question, Elaine, about Tower Grove House and the museum being connected. We're hoping that we forge a greater connection there, but a greater connection garden-wide in the years to come. So,
You know, that's a great idea too. That's exciting because people do, you know, have said that they've been to the Tower Grove House. Oh, I've been there. So it's like, you know, a one-time shot or a two-time shot. So as more things are brought into it, I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we have any information about, you know, the descendants of Trelease and
That's a good question.
what happened to the children?
To the children?
Um,
Yeah, I have not gathered a lot of information about them yet. It's a lot of genealogical work because, as I mentioned, we don't really retain that type of information in our archives. So it's more genealogical work to identify what different people did. At this point, I don't have that, but hopefully, as Jen mentioned, the stories abound. And this is like touching the iceberg, and there's so much more in so many of these topics that could become bigger things. That
I can envision that being a question.
Yeah.
that somebody's gonna ask.
so the interesting thing is there has been a few descendants of Trelease, but also I learned from one of our volunteers at the Visitor Engagement Station that a descendant of Engelman was here. So
yes.
I'm going to put Haley on the spot, but I would say if anyone comes to you and says, hey, I'm a descendant of Trelease or Engelman, I would say give Haley's card out, because it would be interesting to be able to ask some of those individuals questions or have them be able to make connections with her, just so that we can extend that story with whatever might be relevant, because sometimes they come and they share really cool stuff, but we don't hear about it except through you all when you share those with us. So
That's a loss.
Yeah.
it is.
I could have dreamt it, but maybe, didn't they, whoever went through the guest book, find a Trelease that had visited the house? I thought I
Yes.
heard that.
Yes.
I believe that.
I mean, that's what we've been told.
I thought I
believe
heard
that.
that too. But
But that was, I mean, that's more current. Those are,
Yes.
you know,
Right.
that's more current. So it wouldn't.
And secondly, is none, or all of that furniture, that bedroom furniture, did it ever belong to the Trelease?
That's a good question. None of what we because they moved out of the
Sure.
house, they took all their belongings with them. So we have nothing original
Okay.
in relationship
That will
to
be asked.
Dr. Trelease. That will be asked. And
Yeah.
so,
Of the period.
right, it's of the period. And when you speak about it at the beginning, I would discourage you from saying 85% of what you see, because now that percentage is different. So you could say 85% of what you see on the west side of the house, and make sure you make that delineation, because otherwise people will maybe make assumptions. So thank you for pointing that out.
So is anything on the Trelease side at this point Henry Shaw's?
No.
So we could actually say this side was torn down and rebuilt.
Right.
And Dr. Trelease and his family were the first ones to live in this, and so it's representative of the furnishings that they would have.
Yes.
How was the west wing used after Trelease moved in?
Well, that's a good
It looks
question.
like the bedroom, it looks like there's an adult bedroom on the east wing.
Yes, so that's a good question. We don't have a record, like I mentioned, we don't have any interior photos other than that photo that you see of Dr. Trelease that's been on display downstairs for many years. That's taken in the parlor of him working on a typewriter. So, and he's sitting in the dining room chairs, which means we could deduce that he was using some of the furniture that was left there. And maybe it was a more formal, you know,
Maybe for
type of thing for
entertaining.
entertaining. But otherwise, the bedrooms, again, I will make sure that I print that oral history, because there's a cute story in there about the kids jumping on a bed that they say belonged to Henry Shaw.
And so there's cute vignettes like that, which makes me think, okay, maybe the furniture, there's some furniture that just stayed in the house and they just left it for guests, or they were living in it and we don't know. Again, they had 4 children operating in that house. Did everyone have a separate bedroom or did they share? We don't know those types of details, unfortunately, which is why we've chosen to represent stories in separate rooms just to create some clarity. Yes, Elaine?
So it was kind of my understanding that our reception room was Trelease's office. Is that?
I mean, it looks like a library to me, and I agree with you that if they were uninterested in using the formality of a parlor and dining room area, that's a very easy way to have just a comfortable, but I can't say with any certainty. I don't have a written record that tells me that this is what they used.
So,
what
I mean,
for.
in essence, that picture that we have, that could have been taken before that,
In theory,
and so he would have been
he could have, yes.
in that room,
Yes,
perhaps.
yes, we don't
working.
know.
Okay,
Yes.
so all of that is supposition.
Yes, and so you could say that.
Yeah.
In that, I always try to give a caveat by saying oral tradition says, because we don't have, if somebody asks me for a reference tomorrow, I don't have that, but it's an oral tradition and it's something that you can deduce visually. You know, someone will look around and say, oh yeah, this looks like a library, and be comfortable with that.
So are we going to open that butler's pantry ever?
Hopefully eventually.
Okay.
Right now it is still storage and completely unchanged essentially. So that would be, you know, the list gets longer.
Because
the
I
list
mean,
just keeps going, yes, but that would be
makes
nice.
room
Different, yes.
be the dining room. I mean, if you have a butler's pantry
Yes.
adjoining it, it makes sense that
Yes.
room was the dining
That's
room.
what I
Right.
always thought.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's what makes sense visually.
Yeah, right.
But again, nobody wrote down, I use this room for
Yeah.
this, and I use this room from this. So all we can do is deduce through visualization what the function of a room is. And if they used it that way, who knows? Plenty of us have formal dining rooms in our homes that collect mail, you know? that they may have that function, but they aren't practically used
Haley,
that way.
even early days of the family, you don't have interior shots.
No, and Haley and I have kind of talked about this too. So some of you know that I lived in a house on the corner of Shaw and Alfred before Ridgeway was built. It was on garden grounds. And I learned from Andy Colligan, the garden's archivist, I don't know, about a year or so ago, that there's only a few pictures of that house on the exterior. Archives has not one internal photograph. Do you know where those internal photographs are? In my family photo
I was
album.
gonna say, you probably have.
Yeah, so it was an eye-opening. So when Haley says it was kind of standard operation, I often think, how often does the garden go through any building and take tons of interior shots for
So the
archival
family
purposes?
perhaps.
Right, and
Yeah.
so like I mentioned, I found
Yeah.
this scrapbook at the University of Illinois. They've sent me images of Mr. and Mrs. Trelease and other family members, but they finally sent me the listing for the whole box, and they're telling me that there are images of the kids at certain ages, which to me says maybe they're pictures at the garden.
Yeah.
And so I'm waiting for them to scan those and send me what those look like before I can acquire those.
Yeah.
So stay tuned because some of those are still in process. Again, the other problem is that at that time you always put photos in a scrapbook, which means they're having to do chemical conservation processes to unadhere it from the scrapbook to scan them for me.
Yeah.
I guess we're the first persons to ever be interested, and so it's taking more time than I would like, but because I'm excited to see what they look like, but hopefully I will have, and because they're not on panels, and we've already submitted the signage, of course, but those are things that we could print into those cards and have the laminate that you could use as a sheet to show visitors like we use in other rooms. Yes.
So people are always interested about the steps going up to the 3rd floor.
Yes.
Now they're going to start talking more about the Trelease family.
Yes.
It's just still summation whether or not they really use those rooms upstairs as bedrooms for the children. We don't really know. Do
It's
we know
most
anything?
likely that they were used for the house help. So the that nanny cook I talked about, Mrs. Smalley, and then there was one other man that was employed that's mentioned in that oral history. And so those two people, in theory, could have lived on that top floor, but again, nobody's writing down if the help is living.
But based on size of rooms, are they
They're very
smaller?
large, no,
They're-
there's two that are smaller and there's one that's like an attic space essentially. And so they could be, the two that are smaller could be bedroom size.
So when we first started,
Nelia,
Nelia, she was talking about an elderly gentleman that had come through, and he, either he or his father had been a young man. I think his father had been a young man, visited in a relative that worked for the Trelease, and that was the servants' quarters.
Yeah, but that's where
But
the
that's-
help lived upstairs is.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so again, we have our oral documentation that's what that's used for, because they're not thinking of historians in the future. So if you have your own home and your plans, write down what you do in those rooms. Because historians will thank you
You
one
never
day.
know who's gonna want that
Yeah.
information.
And take pictures of the
Yes,
interior.
what it looked
rooms.
like, yes,
Yeah.
Brenna.
The new house was built in 1913.
I believe they started building it around 1912.
Okay, I guess what I'm wondering is.
I'm not
if-
certain, I'm not certain, don't quote me.
Trelease left in 12, and the new house wasn't ready. Where did the successor live?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've read different things about that, so I can't give you a certain answer. There's no record that Dr. Moore lived in Tower Grove House, but if that's where furniture was, he in theory could have slept there for a few months. I don't know what the exact dates are. That's something I will write down.
Was he
to
a
look up.
bachelor?
I can't speak to that either. I don't know much. I've been in Trelease world for the last few months, so I don't know much about him. Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking.
I think Tyler told me when I first heard that Moore lived in Tower Grove House for about 6 months.
Yeah, I think so.
And then and they were finishing the
other house.
No, but he said he had read someplace, I don't know where he got it.
Yeah, I've read a lot
about
of
6
different
months.
things. So yeah, I'll have to look into that.
About
Thank
6
you
months. So.
for that, Dave. Do we have any other questions?
Someone said, I'm trying to recollect it, it was one of those nights during Christmas when there's 10,000 people.
Oh, those
going
nights,
through,
yeah.
But that they knew somebody who I thought maybe was a child of Moore that lived in the house for a very short period of time.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know
So,
much
you know,
about his
maybe you could
family.
try that.
Yes, thank you.
Because that would have been, what, 1913, whatever?
Yeah.
About 19, yeah, okay.
Other questions? I know this is a lot. Go ahead.
Just curious, how many directors have there been between Dr. Moore and
This is my quiz for the day.
Dr. Peter Raven?
We used to have that in Tower Grove House, and we had all of the directors
Signage.
and on the signage in that room, the dining room.
Yeah, I missed that.
I want to say we're close to 7 or 8.
I would think at least that.
So some of them probably longer.
There was one period where they kind of had a few in short succession, but then Dr. Raven was here for 40 years. So let me get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Because I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't keep that.
I have a
It's a guy
plumbing
that-
question. Plumbing question. I've always been perplexed about the fact that we have hot and cold water spigots on the tub and a pump in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Was that, we don't know if that's
I
for
don't
real.
know. I don't know that. The fixtures in the tub, I believe to be more real, because the tub is the tub. I would guess that those are original fixtures. Someone asked me in the new volunteer training about how water, where if there was a well where the wastewater went.
Yeah.
For example, and I don't know that either. So again, because we have maps of the garden, but we don't necessarily have operational underground plans. that's more difficult to identify. So that certainly could be on the list.
When did it become part of the city,
What?
the house, the garden, or the incorporated, so that it might be tied in with the sewage system and that kind of stuff?
Because we've always been private, running, I cannot find a record of how they convinced the city to pipe water out here. Through best summations, yes, Linda,
There
come up
was a
quickly.
theory that
Yes.
I was told is when the Arsenal hospital system.
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah, that's the oral tradition I've heard, is that when they created that hospital over off Arsenal, they
that
put
was
water to that.
accessible to.
And then, so once the garden transitions to a director, the Shaw neighborhood, that land is eventually parsed off within the first 10 years. And so those houses, if there's a neighborhood, I can see how it would be more likely that water would run our direction. Between Tower Group Park and a neighborhood, more things would support that. But I can look specifically about that. Any other questions? Great. I know there's plenty of questions are going to come. So this is my plea to you to be patient with all of us, because we're all, I don't want to say we're new to this material, but we're interpreting it in a different way and using it a lot more than we've ever used it in the past. So questions are going to come up. You're more than welcome to write them down, send them to me, write them, send me a pigeon, a letter, anything you can do to get those questions back to me, because I want to make sure. I don't know yet what the frequently asked questions are in this exhibit, and that's just a part of opening a new exhibit, is finding out what people are interested in, what questions they're going to ask you on a regular basis, and just doing our best to say, I'm not sure, let me check into that if somebody has a question that you can't answer, and that being an okay answer. Yes.
So the artifact profiles, are they only available through the Vine, or can't?
They are primarily, that's their primary distribution in terms of the first day you can get them. I try to print them and put them in a book in the house, so that way if you have time and it's slow and you want to do some reading, you can acquire that from our resource library. One of the staff could help you find that. And so they are on paper. I don't ever print a stack to hand out, but...
Can somebody that's not a volunteer see them?
No, at this point they've been primarily they're volunteer resource material at this point for all of the education volunteers. So that's docents, that's educators, that's anybody who receives the Vine, which is about, Andrea, 200 people, I'm sorry, receiving the Vine.
Currently there's 317 people that receive the Vine.
Yes. So
staff.
Thank you. So at this point, it's just been a staff and volunteer resource. So we've considered trying to figure out how to transition it to like the blog online, because we have a pretty prolific blog going on right now at our Discover and Share. So we're trying to figure out how to transition that in the right way, but they have plenty of their own content to share. So I have to figure out how to slide us in there. So thank you. Yes, Janet.
Well, curiosity question now about service. Are you going to have places to sign up as service, like somebody going to be placed on the east wing and somebody downstairs? Or?
Yes. Thank you for segueing into the next bullet. So come with me on this journey as you imagine what this looks like. I have a vision that a visitor talks to almost every volunteer or staff member when they come to the house, because the house is so big. We have so much to share in different areas, and we've had a lot of success stationing volunteers throughout the house, especially during our Garden Glow experience. It offers you the opportunity to know exactly where you're going to be, to choose essentially what you enjoy speaking about, and it gives you the opportunity to make a selection before you come and know where you want to be. So when you log into service, I will open the shifts, maybe not today, but probably tomorrow morning. You will be able to see each shift still has 3 spots in it, as you're accustomed to, but you'll see that it says next to it parlor, it'll say east wing first floor, or it'll say second floor. So in theory, if you signed up for the second floor, you would be able to move all the way either in this exhibit or on the west side and help answer those questions. If you signed up for the parlor, you'd be stationed in the parlor, informal dining room, talking about more traditional Henry Shaw stuff. The East Wing first floor is fun because you're kind of floating in that reception, kitchen, programming area that has its own exhibits still. But that's going to give all of us the opportunity to talk to people as they come through. I know that many of you at times, especially if it's slow, say, oh, I only talked to like 2 people today when you had 10 in the house. And I know that that's really hard. And so I'm hoping that this system allows you to both know what your expectation is in terms of what you're sharing, but also offer you that opportunity to talk to everyone. It's also going to be hugely important to us that the staff are actively involved in interpreting to our guests. We are a team, all of us together, staff, volunteers, we are one big team. And so I have decided that it is now the staff's task to greet people at the front door and say, hello, welcome to Tower Grove House. Get just that quick conversation. You've entered the country home of Henry Shaw, excuse me. Have you been here before? And ask those basic questions and then say, that's wonderful. If you step into the parlor here with Janet, you'll learn a little bit more about Henry Shaw. And so that way they're controlling traffic, because as many of you know, if it's busy, you also have people backing up the door, people don't know which direction to go. So the staff are creating that expectation of which area people can go to. They could say it's a self-guided experience, and then they head upstairs, and then they'll meet another volunteer who's ready to answer those questions, but maybe not give them that formal introduction. So this is something that's a little bit different, and I understand. I certainly am not in the business of tying you to a room. We're not tying anybody to a chair. So you're free to move throughout the house. But I really want everyone to have the opportunity to be in an area to know that this is where I'm interpreting today, this is where I'm answering questions, and hearing that, and are able to kind of share that team with your other volunteers in the house. Again, as many as you may know, sometimes there's only 2 volunteers, and so that is going to change where people are positioned, and make things a little bit different. The staff member at the front door might need to be someone giving an introduction in the reception room and still sending people to the parlor. You know, it's a flexible thing that we want to try to see if that helps everybody get to know people and meet all of our visitors. But again, as we start the season, I'm ready to hear the feedback and figure out if this is something that works for us or something that is not working, so how we could improve. Yes, Barb, yes.
Is there going to be an expected flow, like which way people?
No, so it's still an open flow, but that staff member, if they're standing at the front door, can say, if you step into the parlor with Barb, she's going to give you a little introduction to what's going on here. And so that way they're helping people. All of us have seen people walk into the house and be like, where am I? That staff member is there to make people comfortable, to direct traffic in a less direct way, but in a more comfortable way. Like, if you step in here, this is what your expectation is. It's still a self-guided experience, in that volunteers are here to support visitor need. However, if somebody walks in and they say to the staff person, is this a tour? Can I have a tour? If you're available to spend 30 minutes with that person, you're also welcome to do that. So we're open to meeting our visitors where they are.
Dynamic.
It is. Every visitor comes with their own agenda, and it's up to us as a team to provide that connection to the garden, a memorable and a personal experience. And so the staff person at the door, if somebody says, well, is there a tour? We can say, well, it's a self-guided experience, but if you'd like to have a tour throughout the house, Dave is in the parlor, and if Dave's willing to do that for today, Dave can kind of take them through. We do have some docents that would kind of prefer to do that in some capacities, and so we just don't want to be in a position to tell someone no. It's knowing who your audience is, knowing who the team is for the day, and who's interested in providing what type of experience.
I also mentioned that the staff are expected to offer programming. So there may be a time where they're over in the East Wing offering a program to a family, and they might say that you're in the reception room. They might say, "Hey, Jackie, will you watch the door and help people get comfortable?" That might come up. But we want it to be an active experience. We want it to be something where you're able to answer questions, where you're in the right places to tell those stories instead of waiting for those people to come back to you and ask those questions. We also want everyone to be comfortable. There'll be chairs stationed in different areas to make sure that everyone is still comfortable. If it's a slow day, as I mentioned, we always have our resource library where you can read resources out of our packs that might be something new to learn from. But again, we're going to pilot this and see if it works and see if it works for everyone. It's been very successful during our Garden Glow experience, and I'm hoping that we can transition that expectation of people in all of our spaces to help it come alive to that daytime experience. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question, but a comment. I mean, for
Yes.
some people that come there twice a year, they don't want to have to go into a room and say, I've already been here. You know, so if there are multiple people wanting to give them a little mini tour, I can see if I've been in this house dozens of times, every time I move forward. But I've heard it.
Yeah.
Oh, I've heard it, and I appreciate it, and I love it, and that's why I come
Yes.
back.
Yes.
I just want to be here.
Yes.
Coming in to warm up.
Well, yes, and so it's still the same. I say self-guided because the visitor is choosing if they want to talk to someone.
Right.
But you are stationed in the right place in case they do want to talk to
Right.
someone.
Right.
And if they want something more than that, if they say, I want you to talk to me for 2 seconds, or I want you to talk to me for 30 minutes, I want to be able to offer them that flexibility because we
And I
don't
think
know.
that's great. I was just thinking of the repeat visitors.
And they'll probably say thank you, and you'll
Yeah.
smile at them as they walk through the room that you're stationed in
Yeah.
and carry on. So, and that's okay too.
Don't be careful.
And if
Well,
all
they
they
do
hear
that now.
5 times for that day while they're in the house for 20 minutes is, "Hi, welcome to Tower Grove House," and they say, "Oh, I've been here before," and shut
Yeah.
you down, just say, "I'm so glad you're here today, thank you for visiting."
Absolutely.
Because then, if they've heard that 5 times, think of how they're going to leave. They're going to feel, welcome and appreciated,
They saw
and
all
that they
these
met
faces.
5 friendly
Right.
faces, and that's okay.
Well, they're gonna see some new things.
I would hope.
I mean,
Yeah, they will on
because
the-
obviously there are new things to see.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so I'll pick on Dave and Ginny a minute. They're docents, and when they've been out to do tours, sometimes people will say, "Oh, I'm a member of the garden," and then I'm like, "Well, so?" So the challenge is for them, in some ways, is to say, "Well, would you like to take a walk for me?" And I would guarantee 98% of the time, those members who come all the time have learned one new thing about the garden
Oh,
because they
absolutely.
interacted with someone new.
Right.
And so, I think that's part of the fun
I
of
think
our
it's
job.
almost 100%.
And Sandy,
Because I
Yeah.
have never had anyone, but I say, tell me if I'm repeating something, and invariably, I didn't know that.
right.